haven't taken advantage of this as much as we should. Hopefully we'll be rolling it out in the next year or so. The idea is when you're running a bridge relay, it's just like a normal Tor relay. It's got an IP address, but it also has an identity key. So the goal is, if we tell the users, here's its current IP address and here's its identity key, and the bridge is on a dynamic IP address or something like that, so it changes its IP address every so often, as long as the user knows the identity key and they've got some way to reach the bridge authority, for example, they have a bridge that still works, then they can connect through Tor to the bridge authority and say, I know the identity key, can you tell me where he is now? So that would mean that once you've got 5 or 6 bridges, as long as they don't all disappear at once, then you can use the ones that are still working to be able to follow the other ones. And this is all software, it all happens in the background. So one of the neat things here, the goal for this whole circumvention thing, the original problem was, how do you publish 1,500 IP addresses to the whole world and keep them out of the hands of the Chinese government, which is an impossible problem, to how do you take these 10,000 or 20,000 or 30,000 bridge addresses and give them out one at a time to the good guys without letting the bad guys learn all of them. And that's hopefully an arms race that we can handle better. The big problem with that arms race right now is we have 400 bridges, not 10,000 or 20,000. So all of those people who are running Tor clients right now, they should become bridges. We don't need very much bandwidth. You're not going to end up blacklisted by anybody because nobody even knows that you're running the bridge. So that's a really important thing that you guys can help us do over the next while. There are a lot of people in Iran and China and other places who would really like to be able to reach the Tor network, and there's certainly an arms race going on right now between China and other places trying to hunt down the bridges we've got and the people who are trying to use them, trying to learn about new ones. Okay, so what else have we been working on? That's mostly how do you change the discovery problem so that there's a way for them to find an IP address that they can connect to. At the same time, you also have to think about the network fingerprint side of things. Originally, we did plain text HTTP for our directory fetches. And that's how SmartFilter and WebSense and so on were able to block it. They could actually, I mean, we did an HTTP request for /tor/something, and easy to block, easy to find. So we fixed that. Now we look pretty much like Firefox talking to Apache over SSL. And one of the really neat things there, Iran kicked out SmartFilter earlier this year. They said, we don't need those Western pigs running our network. We can run our network just fine. And that meant that the old version of Tor started working again because they weren't filtering based on the old fingerprint. And one of the really neat things is about half of the people in Iran in June were using the old version of Tor from 2007. So these are people who years ago installed Tor and said, oh, that's kind of neat, and then they forgot about it, and then suddenly their neighbor said, you can get to Twitter and Facebook if you have Tor installed, and they said, oh, I already have Tor installed, I'll try it. So the fact that Iran decided to grow its own homebrew censoring system meant that the version of Tor that these people had from years ago started working again. That's kind of a neat feature. One of the other weird things at that point, Iran was an unusual combination in June because they were really bad at understanding the internet. They were really incompetent at filtering the internet at the beginning of June, but they were really, really good at physically tracking people down and arresting them and finding them and so on. So it was a weird sort of imbalance where the internet worked great if you knew how to use it, and real world was really hard to keep safe. And there are still people coming through the Iranian firewall using newfangled protocols. I'm not going to specify what comes after IPv4 so that people will block it, but if you use some other protocols, then they don't censor things very well. Okay, so let's think a little bit more about what sort of things we're up against. What is the attacker trying to do here? So there are two big things that they're trying to do. They're trying to block certain types of information, stuff that's embarrassing, rights violations, corruption, that sort of thing, and stuff that's opposing, opposition movements. So if people are actually trying to, let's meet at this street corner and have a protest, those are the sorts of things they're trying to block. And they don't have to block everything. They don't have to shut down all the websites. They don't have to shut down all the circumvention tools. All they have to do is give people the impression that they're still in control. So they really just have to shut down the tools that are really effective. If millions of people are using it, they've got to do something about it. And the ones that are really visible, really loud. So if there's a New York Times article every day on how this particular tool is bringing freedom to Iran, then they have to do something about that. So part of our challenge was, how do we find the right balance where we stay completely out of the Western press, but through word of mouth and other approaches, we tell everybody in these countries who needs to know about Tor how a bridge works, how you get one, things like that. Another thing to keep in mind, they're not going to go after people who passively read information. I keep talking to security experts who say, well, all China needs to do is find 20 Tor users in China, kill them publicly, and then nobody's going to use Tor again. And I was at a conference with a bunch of Chinese people, and I told them this story, and they all laughed. They're like, China's not going to kill 20 Tor users. Come on, they're ordinary citizens. They can't do that. They can't afford to do that. So part of the thing to keep in mind here from talking to people on the ground in these places, if you read the Wikipedia article on freedom in China, they're not going to do anything. They don't care. If you wrote the Wikipedia article on freedom in China, then they really do care. So there are a small number of really important publishers out there that need to keep really safe. And there are a whole lot of other people who they need their circumvention. They need to get around the firewall, but they're not going to get rounded up and killed just for reading the wrong article. And one of the neat things about Tor is if you're watching somebody using Tor, if you know they're a Tor user, it's not clear which class this person's in. If there are 50,000 people in China, and 8 of them are writing on their blogs, and 49,900 some are reading blogs, then there's a lot of cover for people to blend in with. And then another thing to keep in mind, which is another variation on that, a lot of countries have various incentives not to block the whole thing. When I started on this, I was thinking, okay, so if I make China turn off the internet, did I win or did I lose? And at this point, it doesn't matter, because China's not going to turn off the internet. They can't afford to. But a lot of places don't mind collateral damage for a while. There's I think India a couple of years ago had an interesting story where somebody in Pakistan published something on a blog, something religious, and India said, there's going to be a war if our citizens read that, so you should censor that website. So they went to the top ISPs in India and said, can you please censor these 3 websites? So they did, and it turned out to be a website that nobody there had heard of called, I think it was Blogspot. And so India censored Blogspot for 3 days, and that made a lot of people in India really angry because they said, well, wait a minute, I thought I lived in a democracy, and they're censoring 50,000 blogs. What's going on here? One of the other interesting pieces from that, pretty much exactly the same story happened 6 or 7 years ago in Thailand. Thailand was one of the first countries that blocked torproject.org, that blocked people reaching our domain. And I kept hearing from people in Thailand, I live in a democracy. They're blocking the web. I'm going to sue. They can't do this. And then a few years later, the tanks roll, and it turns out they don't quite live in a democracy. So part of the challenge of working on Tor, part of the feature of working on Tor is we hear before these things happen from people in alleged democracies who are suddenly being censored in different ways. Okay, so what sort of attacks do we have in mind here? How do people actually censor their networks? The first ones are pretty much universal, block by IP address or port at the firewall. Another one is you intercept DNS requests and you try to, if somebody's asking for wikileaks.com, then you send them to a local page saying, this is content you should not be looking at as a good citizen. If you're lucky, you get that sort of page in Saudi Arabia or something like that. In China, they just send you to a blank page, or you get a did not resolve or something like that. China has another trick where they look inside the TCP packets for certain keywords that they don't want you to say, like Falun, for example. If you're talking about certain religions, then they will send reset packets in both directions. Iran has bought all this newfangled hardware from American and European corporations, so they're doing deep packet inspection to identify SSL, even if you do it on something other than port 443. Russia has its own tricks. They don't actually filter the internet, at least not very much. Instead, they just pollute the blogosphere. So there are a lot of people in Russia who try to